My name is Irina Volkova. I'm 82 years old. And I'm going to tell you about how a Soviet general raped me repeatedly, deliberately infected me with syphilis as a medical experiment, and then told me I'd die slowly and painfully with no one ever knowing what he'd done. I pull out a medical file, thick with documents. This is my complete medical history. 64 years of documentation. Treatment records. Test results. Neurological damage assessments. Psychiatric evaluations. Every single page traces back to what General Dmitry Volkov did to me in 1960 when I was 18 years old. I open the file to show photographs. Medical photographs of lesions, rashes, deterioration. Syphilis doesn't just disappear. Even after treatment, it leaves marks. Scars. Damage. I've had heart problems. Neurological issues. Chronic pain. Memory problems. All stemming from the 3 months he let the infection rage through my body before anyone treated me. He did this deliberately. Not in the heat of passion. Not by accident. He chose to infect me. He had syphilis, knew he had it, and raped me anyway. Multiple times. Then he prevented me from receiving treatment, documenting my decline like I was a laboratory rat. I closed the file and looked directly at the camera. General Dmitry Volkov died in 2019 at age 89. But before he died, I did something no one thought possible. I testified against him at the International Criminal Court in The Hague. I was 78 years old. He was 85. And I looked him in the eyes in that courtroom and watched him be convicted of crimes against humanity. He thought he was untouchable. A decorated Soviet general. A hero of Afghanistan. A man with connections at the highest levels of Russian power. He thought his crimes died with the Soviet Union. He was wrong. I made sure the world knew exactly what he did. I made sure his medals were stripped. His pension revoked. His name forever associated with the word rapist and war criminal. This is how I did it. I was born in 1942 in Leningrad during the siege. My parents were intellectuals. Father was a university professor of mathematics. Mother was a translator. We were privileged by Soviet standards, which meant we had slightly more food than others, and our apartment only housed 2 families instead of 4. I grew up in the post-war Soviet Union. Stalin died when I was 11. Khrushchev's thaw brought slight liberalization. My parents were cautiously optimistic. Maybe things would improve. Maybe the terror would end. I was a good student. Excellent grades. I wanted to study medicine, become a doctor. In 1959, at age 17, I was accepted to the first Leningrad State Medical Institute. A huge achievement. My parents were so proud. The medical institute was prestigious, competitive, demanding. I loved it. I was finally studying what I dreamed about. Anatomy. Physiology. Disease. Healing. I was going to help people. Save lives. In my second year, 1960, everything changed. The institute had close ties with the military. Soviet military medicine was advanced, and military doctors often lectured at the institute. Medical students, especially promising ones, were sometimes selected for special military medical programs. In October 1960, I was selected. I thought it was an honor. A recognition of my abilities. I was told I'd be working with senior military medical researchers on an important project. Classified. High level. It would look excellent on my record. I was assigned to a military medical facility outside Leningrad. Secret location. High security. When I arrived, I was told I'd be assisting General Dmitry Volkov with his research. General Volkov was 41 years old. Senior military medical officer. Decorated war veteran. Had served in World War II as a field surgeon. Now he oversaw military medical research programs. Important man. Connected. Powerful. He specialized in infectious disease research. Studying how diseases spread. How to treat them in combat conditions. How to weaponize them if necessary, though that part was never stated explicitly. I met him on my first day. Tall man. Still fit at 41. Cold eyes. He looked at me the way a scientist looks at a specimen. Not the way a professor looks at a student. "You're the new medical student?" he said. "Young. That's good. Fresh mind. No preconceptions. You'll assist me directly." I was flattered. Naive. 18 years old and stupid. The first week was normal. I worked in his laboratory. Took notes. Prepared samples. Observed experiments on rabbits and rats. Studying bacterial infections. How they progressed. How different treatments worked. General Volkov was professional. Strict but fair. Taught me a lot. I learned more in that week than in months of lectures. The second week, he started asking personal questions. About my family. My background. My boyfriend. I had one, Alexei, a fellow medical student. Volkov asked if we were sexually active. I was mortified but answered honestly. No, we weren't. Soviet morality was strict. Good girls waited for marriage. He nodded. Made notes in his journal. I didn't understand why he was asking. The third week, he called me to his private office. Late evening. The other staff had left. Just him and me in the facility. He told me he'd selected me for a special study. Important research. I'd be the subject. Paid research. I'd receive extra stipend. All I had to do was agree to medical monitoring and follow his protocols. I asked what kind of study. He said it was classified but involved studying the progression of infectious disease in young, healthy subjects. Nothing dangerous. Controlled. Monitored. Completely safe. I should have asked more questions. But he was a general. A decorated officer. A respected researcher. I trusted the system. Trusted authority. I signed the consent form. I didn't read it carefully. 18 years old and stupid. That night, he raped me in his office. I fought. Screamed. He was stronger. 41 years old but military trained. He held me down on his desk and raped me while I cried and begged him to stop. When he finished, he stood up, adjusted his uniform, and said calmly, "You're now infected with syphilis. I have the disease. I've just transmitted it to you. This is part of the study you consented to. We're going to monitor how the infection progresses in a young, previously healthy female subject. You will not receive treatment yet. We need baseline data." I couldn't process what he'd said. I was in shock. Traumatized. He just raped me and told me he'd deliberately infected me with a disease. He continued in that same calm clinical tone. "You'll report to me weekly for examination. I'll document the progression. Symptoms. Stages. Response. If you tell anyone about this, I'll have you arrested for breaching state security. This is classified military medical research. You signed consent. No one will believe you. And your family will suffer consequences." He opened the door. "You're dismissed. Next examination is in 1 week. Don't be late." I stumbled out of his office in shock. I went back to my dormitory. I didn't tell anyone. I was too scared. Too ashamed. Too confused. That was the beginning. The first week after the rape, I developed symptoms. Genital sores. Painful. Exactly as textbooks described primary syphilis. I knew what was happening to me. I was a medical student. I recognized the signs. I went back to Volkov as ordered. He examined me clinically. Documented the lesions. Took photographs. Measured. Noted everything in his journal. Treated me like a lab specimen, not a human being. Then he raped me again. Additional exposure, he said, to study reinfection effects. This became the pattern. Weekly examinations, where he documented my disease progression, then raped me. Sometimes twice. Sometimes in different positions. He claimed he was studying whether sexual activity affected disease progression. It was systematic rape disguised as medical research. Week 2. The primary lesions healed. I felt slightly better. Hoped maybe it was over. Volkov told me this was expected. Primary stage resolving. Secondary stage will begin soon. Week 4. Secondary syphilis began. Rash covering my body. Fever. Fatigue. Hair falling out in patches. I looked sick. Felt sick. My roommates at the dormitory asked what was wrong. I lied. Said it was stress. Allergies. Anything but the truth. Volkov was excited by my symptoms. Excellent progression. Textbook presentation. This will be valuable data. He photographed every rash, every lesion, documented my weight loss, my declining health, and kept raping me weekly. I tried to see a doctor outside the military facility. Went to the university health clinic. They did basic examination, said I had some kind of infection, prescribed antibiotics. Not the right antibiotics. They didn't know it was syphilis because I didn't tell them. I was too terrified of Volkov's threats. Week 6. I was deteriorating. Severe headaches. Vision problems. The disease was progressing to neurological involvement. I could barely focus on my studies. My grades dropped. My boyfriend Alexei asked what was wrong. I couldn't tell him. Couldn't tell anyone. Week 8. Volkov noted my neurological symptoms with satisfaction. Neurosyphilis developing. Faster than typical. Stress may be accelerating progression. Fascinating. I begged him to treat me. Please. I'm dying. This is killing me. You have the data. Please give me treatment. He considered it. Not yet. I need at least 12 weeks of progression data. Be patient. This is important scientific work. Week 10. I could barely function. Constant headaches. Confusion. Memory problems. My parents visited and were horrified by how I looked. I'd lost 15 kilograms. Hair thin and patchy. Skin covered in rashes. They wanted to take me home. Get me to doctors. I refused. I was terrified. Volkov had made it clear, if I told anyone, my family would suffer. This was the Soviet Union. He could have my father arrested. My mother blacklisted. Me sent to a psychiatric institution. He had that power. Week 11. I tried to kill myself. Took pills. Alexei found me and got me to hospital. They pumped my stomach. Psychiatric evaluation. I told them I was stressed about studies. They believed me. Prescribed sedatives and sent me home. Volkov was angry when I missed my weekly examination. He came to the hospital. Told the staff he was my military supervisor checking on one of his research assistants. They let him see me. He stood by my hospital bed and said quietly, "If you try that again, I'll make sure your family pays for it. You'll complete the study." 11 weeks down. One more to go. Week 12. December 1960. I was skeletal. Sick. Neurologically damaged. Barely human. Volkov conducted his final examination. Documented everything. Then he finally gave me treatment. Penicillin injections. "The study is complete," he said. "Excellent data. You've contributed significantly to Soviet medical science." Then he raped me one last time. For completion's sake. The penicillin worked. Slowly. The infection began to clear. The rashes faded. The fever broke. But the damage was done. Neurosyphilis had caused permanent neurological damage. I had tremors. Memory problems. Chronic headaches. The doctors treating me, who didn't know the full story, were confused about why I'd let syphilis progress so far without treatment. I couldn't return to medical school. I'd missed too many classes. My health was too poor. I was expelled for academic failure and unreliability. My dreams of becoming a doctor were destroyed. Volkov moved on. Transferred to another post. His research continued. I learned later he'd published papers on syphilis progression based on his research, meaning based on what he'd done to me. He was praised for his contributions to military medicine. I tried to tell someone. Went to military authorities. Tried to report what he'd done. They laughed at me. Said I was a disgraced medical student trying to blame her failures on a decorated general. Said if I persisted, I'd be arrested for slander and defaming a military officer. I gave up. I was 19 years old, broken, sick, and powerless. I spent the next 5 years barely surviving. Couldn't hold jobs because of my neurological problems. My boyfriend Alexei left me when he learned I had syphilis. Assumed I'd been promiscuous. My reputation was destroyed. My parents stood by me but didn't understand what had happened. I couldn't tell them. The shame. The fear. The threat. In 1965, I attempted suicide again. More seriously this time. Slit my wrists. My mother found me in time. Psychiatric hospital for 6 months. They diagnosed me with chronic depression and neurological damage from inadequately treated syphilis. No one asked how I'd gotten syphilis. They assumed I'd been a prostitute or promiscuous. I was labeled damaged goods. Ruined. A cautionary tale. But something changed during that hospital stay. Another patient, an older woman named Svetlana, had also been raped by a military officer decades earlier. She'd never told anyone. She encouraged me to document everything while I still remembered. So I started writing. Everything. Every detail. Dates. Times. Locations. What Volkov had said. What he'd done. The progression of the disease. The examinations. The rapes. All of it. I filled notebooks. Hidden notebooks. Because I realized something. Even if I couldn't get justice now, maybe someday I could. Maybe when the Soviet Union fell, if it ever fell, there would be opportunity. I waited. And I documented. And I survived. Years passed. I rebuilt some semblance of life. Got a job as a library assistant. Quiet work that didn't strain my damaged brain too much. Never married. Never had children. The syphilis had caused reproductive damage. I lived quietly. But I never forgot. And I never stopped documenting. 1970s. I started collecting information about Volkov. His career was thriving. Promoted to colonel, then to general. Hero of the Soviet-Afghan War in the 1980s. Decorated officer. Respected military medical researcher. Meanwhile, I was a broken woman working in a library, living alone, dealing with chronic health problems and trauma. 1980s. Gorbachev. Glasnost. Perestroika. Things were opening up. People were starting to talk about Soviet crimes. I wrote letters to journalists. Human rights organizations. The new ombudsman offices. Told my story. Most ignored me. A few responded with sympathy but said there was nothing they could do. Volkov was too powerful. Too connected. And my story was from 30 years ago. No evidence except my word. But I had evidence. I had my medical records. I had my notebooks. I had documentation. 1991 the Soviet Union collapsed. I was 49 years old. I'd spent 31 years waiting for this moment. I went to the new Russian authorities. Tried to file charges. They said military crimes from the Soviet era were complicated. Jurisdictional issues. Statute of limitations. Volkov was retired now, living in Moscow, respected elder statesman of Russian military medicine. Again, nothing happened. But the world was changing. International law was evolving. The International Criminal Court was being established. War crimes. Crimes against humanity. Suddenly there were mechanisms for justice that hadn't existed before. I started studying international law. Spent my evenings in the library where I worked, reading everything I could about the ICC, about war crimes tribunals, about what constituted crimes against humanity. And I realized something. What Volkov had done to me could be prosecuted. Systematic rape. Medical experimentation without consent. Use of biological weapons, deliberately infecting someone with disease. These were all crimes against humanity under international law. I just needed to find the right venue. The right time. The right evidence. 2000s. I connected with international human rights organizations. Sent them my documentation. My medical records. My notebooks. The papers Volkov had published, which I could prove were based on experiments conducted on me without real consent. Most organizations were sympathetic but said it would be difficult. Russia would never extradite Volkov. The ICC had limited jurisdiction. This was a Soviet-era crime. Complicated. But one organization, based in the Netherlands, was interested. They specialized in documenting Soviet-era human rights abuses. They took my case seriously. They investigated. Verified my medical records. Found the papers Volkov had published. Interviewed me extensively. Built a case. In 2015, they filed a complaint with the ICC. Accused General Dmitry Volkov of crimes against humanity. Systematic rape. Medical experimentation. War crimes. Russia refused to cooperate. Said it was anti-Russian propaganda. That the ICC had no jurisdiction. That Volkov was a hero being slandered by Western organizations. But the case moved forward anyway. 2017, I was 75 years old. The ICC agreed to hear testimony in the case against Volkov, even though Russia refused to extradite him. It would be a trial in absentia, but it would be public, official, documented. I was invited to testify at The Hague. I'd spent 57 years waiting for this moment. I flew to the Netherlands in September 2017. First time I'd ever left Russia. First time I'd been on a plane. I was terrified and exhilarated simultaneously. The ICC building was modern, clean, professional. So different from the dark Soviet military facility where Volkov had raped me. So different from the corrupt Russian courts that had ignored me. They prepared me for testimony. Explained the process. Warned me it would be difficult. That I'd have to describe everything in detail. That the defense, appointed for Volkov even in his absence, would challenge my credibility. I was ready. I'd been ready for 57 years. The hearing began. The courtroom was filled with judges, attorneys, journalists, observers. Everything was recorded. Translated into multiple languages. Broadcast. I was called to testify. I walked to the witness stand. 75 years old. Trembling slightly from the neurological damage Volkov's infection had left me with. But standing straight. Determined. I swore to tell the truth. Then I told my story. I testified for 6 hours over 2 days. Every detail. The rape. The deliberate infection. The 3 months of research. The documentation. The threats. The lifelong health consequences. I showed my medical records. Decades of treatment for syphilis complications. Neurological damage. Cardiac problems. All traceable to October-December 1960. I showed photographs. Medical photographs from over the years showing the disease's effects. The damage. The scars, not visible like cigarette burns, but internal, documented in X-rays and MRIs and blood tests. I showed Volkov's published papers. Research on syphilis progression. The timeline matched perfectly with my infection. The details matched my case. He'd published his crime as scientific research. The defense attorney tried to discredit me. Said I was an unreliable witness. That I had mental health problems. I did, PTSD from being raped and tortured. That my memory couldn't be trusted after 57 years. That I might have gotten syphilis from consensual sexual activity and blamed Volkov out of spite. I looked at that attorney and said calmly, I have documentation from 1960 to today. Notebooks. Medical records. Evidence. If this was a fantasy or false memory, how did I document it contemporaneously? How did I know details that matched General Volkov's published research? How did I predict the exact medical complications that would develop over decades? The attorney had no answer. Then came the most powerful moment of the trial. The prosecution called their medical expert, an infectious disease specialist who'd reviewed all my records. He testified that my case was clearly not from consensual sexual activity or accidental infection. The documentation shows deliberate infection followed by deliberate denial of treatment, he said. This wasn't medicine. This was experimentation on a human subject without consent. It matches documented Nazi medical experiments. It matches Unit 731 Japanese experiments. This is a crime against humanity disguised as research. He showed the court a timeline. My infection. My symptoms. Volkov's documentation. His published papers. All matching perfectly. This woman, he said, pointing to me, was used as a human guinea pig. And the perpetrator built his career on the data he collected from torturing her. The courtroom was silent. Volkov wasn't in The Hague. Russia had refused to extradite him. But the trial was broadcast internationally, including in Russia. He was watching. I knew he was watching. During my testimony, I looked directly at the camera and spoke to him. General Volkov, I know you're watching this. I want you to know something. You thought you'd broken me. You thought you'd destroyed me. You thought I'd die silent and forgotten while you lived as a hero. My voice was steady, strong. But I survived. Every day I lived was a victory over you. Every day I documented was building your conviction. You spent 57 years thinking you'd gotten away with it. You were wrong. I held up my medical file. This is your legacy. Not your medals. Not your research papers. This. The permanent damage you inflicted on an 18-year-old girl because you could. Because you had power. Because the system protected you. I leaned forward toward the camera. You're 83 years old now. Living comfortably in Moscow. Respected. Honored. But now the world knows what you really are. Not a hero. Not a scientist. A rapist. A torturer. A war criminal. That's your legacy now. That's how history will remember you. The courtroom erupted in whispers. The judges called for order. But I'd said what I needed to say. 3 days later, the ICC announced its verdict. Even though Volkov wasn't present, the tribunal found him guilty in absentia of crimes against humanity. Rape as a war crime. Medical experimentation. Systematic torture. The ruling stated, General Dmitry Volkov deliberately infected Irina Volkova with syphilis, denied her treatment, and documented her suffering as medical research. This constitutes a crime against humanity. The tribunal finds him guilty and issues an international arrest warrant. Russia ignored the warrant. Refused to enforce it. Volkov continued living freely in Moscow. But something had changed. The verdict was public. International. Documented. His name was now officially associated with war crimes. Russian journalists started investigating. Found other victims. Other women Volkov had experimented on during his career. Not many were willing to come forward, but enough did to establish a pattern. His reputation began to crumble. 2018 Russian military authorities, pressured by international attention and domestic scandal, quietly stripped Volkov of some of his military honors. Not all. Russia never fully acknowledged his crimes, but some. His pension was reduced. He was no longer invited to military ceremonies. His published research papers were reviewed. Several were retracted when ethics committees realized they were based on non-consensual human experimentation. His family publicly distanced themselves from him. His children changed their names. His grandchildren refused to see him. He became a pariah. Even in Russia, even among those who didn't care about Soviet crimes, his reputation was toxic. The general who raped students is how he was known. I received letters from other survivors. Women who'd been victimized by military officers. By doctors. By men in power who'd used their positions to abuse. They said my testimony gave them courage. Some came forward with their own stories. The case against Volkov opened doors for other victims of Soviet-era crimes to seek justice through international mechanisms. In 2019, Volkov died. Heart attack. Age 89. He'd spent the last 2 years of his life disgraced, isolated, and marked as a war criminal. His obituary in international newspapers focused not on his military service but on his conviction at The Hague. War criminal Dmitry Volkov dies, was the headline. His funeral was small. A few old military colleagues. His wife, who'd stood by him out of habit, not loyalty. None of his children or grandchildren attended. He was buried in a civilian cemetery. No military honors. No ceremony. No respect. I didn't attend his funeral. But I sent flowers. White lilies. With a card, to General Volkov, justice delayed is still justice. You infected me with disease. I infected your legacy with truth. Rest knowing you lost. Irina. His widow told journalists she threw the flowers away. But she kept the card. Later, she contacted me. Apologized. Said she'd suspected but had been too afraid to confront him. Too afraid to leave. I didn't forgive her. But I understood. I'm 82 years old now. I've lived with the consequences of what Volkov did to me for 64 years. The neurological damage. The chronic pain. The inability to have children. The decades of trauma. I pull out my medical file one more time. Thick with decades of documentation. This file is now archived at The Hague. Part of the permanent record. Evidence in the case against General Dmitry Volkov. Proof that cannot be erased or denied. I look directly at the camera with fierce intensity. To every survivor of rape, medical abuse, abuse of power. Your body remembers even when others forget. Your medical records are evidence. Your documentation matters. Time does not erase crimes. It only tests whether we have the strength to pursue justice. It took me 57 years to testify at The Hague. 57 years from rape to justice. That's almost a lifetime. But I did it. I lived long enough. I stayed strong enough. I documented carefully enough. My voice strengthens with conviction. General Volkov thought he could use me as an experiment, discard me, and live as a hero. He thought his power protected him. He thought his connections made him untouchable. He thought the Soviet system would shield him forever. He was wrong about everything. The system that protected him collapsed. The power he wielded became irrelevant. The connections he relied on abandoned him. And the girl he experimented on became the woman who convicted him in international court. I leaned toward the camera. He infected me with disease deliberately. I infected his legacy with truth. He documented my suffering as research. I documented his crimes as evidence. He thought he was conducting science. He was creating his own conviction. Every medical record I kept. Every symptom I documented. Every effect I recorded. It all became evidence against him. My damaged body became testimony. My survival became victory. Final words, clear and powerful. I survived 3 months of deliberate infection. I survived 64 years of health consequences. I survived the Soviet Union. I survived being ignored and dismissed for decades. And I did more than survive. I testified. I convicted. I won. Dmitry Volkov died at 89 as a convicted war criminal. I'm 82 and still here, still speaking, still ensuring his crimes are remembered. He thought he'd write the story. That his research papers would be his legacy. But I wrote the real story. My testimony. My evidence. My conviction of him. That's his legacy now. Not hero. Not scientist. Rapist. Torturer. War criminal. I survived to tell the truth. And the truth destroyed him. Never forget that survivors, when we refuse to be silenced, are more powerful than any general, any system, any wall of silence. These scars, medical scars, documented in files and records and tests, these became weapons. My damaged body became evidence. My survival became his conviction. I testified in The Hague. I won. Remember that.